So welcome everybody to the second day of our December meeting. Today is December 16th. As we stated yesterday, this meeting is being streamed live on TVW and is also being recorded. The recording will be posted on the commissioner's website following this meeting. Commissioners, during the presentation, please turn off your video feeds. When you have questions or you would like to make a comment, please turn them back on and I will call on you. If the public has any questions or wishes to comment, please use the chat box and go to webinar, and we will address the questions from the public if time permits. Next up, we'll have introductions. Debbie?
Good morning, Debbie Young, Commissioner from San Juan County.
Jim?
Say Shiv or Jim?
Jim, sorry.
Oh, good morning. Sorry. Good morning, Jim Restucci, Commissioner from Yakima County.
Shiv?
Good morning, Shiv Batra from King County, Commissioner.
Hester?
Esther Sarabrin, Commissioner from King County.
Kelly?
Good morning, Kelly Fukai, Commissioner from Spokane County.
And I'm Roy Jennings from Clark County, and I serve as the vice chair. Our chair is sick today and will not be attending. We have two ex officio members, Roger Millar.
Good morning, Roger Millar, Secretary of Transportation.
Unfortunately, Debbie Driver from the governor's office is unable to also be with us today. We also have three commission staff members with us. Rima, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, I'm Rima Griffith in Olympia.
Carl? Carl?
There we go. Carl C., Deputy Director for the Transportation Commission.
Tamara?
And Tamara Jones, Senior Policy Analyst with the Commission.
Thank you. Today we'll be continuing our year-long series on the future of transportation post-COVID. So now we're going to hear from speakers who will provide a variety of perspectives and ideas on how COVID-19 has and will impact the future of transportation. First up, we have representatives from the Washington chapter of American Planning Association who will be discussing change transportation planners have been seeing and the impacts on transportation systems. We have York, the president-elect of APA Washington, Patrick, Principal Director, Transportation Planning Services, Transpo Group, Michael, Director of Planning, Seattle, and Chris, Transportation Planner, City of Bellingham. And as I understand it, York, you're first.
A good start, because that's how I understand it as well.
Thank you.
Good morning to the commission. My name is York Stevens Wajda. As you said, I'm the president-elect of American Planning Association's Washington chapter. Understand that you wanted to hear some perspective from us this morning, and I really appreciate the invite. As a policy wonk, the work that you do is fascinating, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it. I will be the president of the chapter, but I am and have been the legislative committee's co-chair for the state chapter since 2015. This will be my last session serving in that role, the upcoming 2021 session, as I just began this service as president-elect, which has a whole pile of new responsibilities, and then the transitioning into that chapter president role next November. I've been working in planning for over 15 years, including comprehensive planning work for a city, 7 years with the Puget Sound Regional Council doing regional planning with a focus on transportation, a couple of years on the King County Boundary Review Board, some transportation planning for Seattle Children's, and my current day job is staff to the Snohomish County Council for all planning related issues. Worth noting that all of my perspective today is my own or that of APA. I definitely try to keep my volunteer and day job hats quite separate. American Planning Association seeks to create great communities for all and advances planning through leadership in education, research, advocacy, and ethical practice. There are more than 40,000 members in the national organization with 47 chapters. There's about 1,200 of us planners in the Washington chapter. And there are 22 divisions nationwide that provide a forum for different topics and groups within planning. And you'll be hearing from folks in our transportation division today. That made me think that I lament that there's often an institutional separation between planning and transportation and public works at local level, sometimes the state as well. I don't think that separation is the best way to serve the state. There's definitely channels for communication between the two. But I appreciate that we have the transportation planners participating in APA and making sure that that voice is integrated into the broad view of planning, which is overall a goal of maximizing the health, safety, and economic well-being of people in a community, and then also furthering some of those intangibles of urban and rural form and culture. So we're here to provide our input on predictions for the future, a post-COVID future. And as some of your previous speakers, I watched a few of the videos in the series have mentioned, that is hard to do. But luckily it's always hard to predict the future. So we do know a couple of ways to address that uncertainty, some of which have already been mentioned in your previous sessions here. Scenario planning can help look at multiple futures and design countermeasures for some of the challenges that those futures can bring. And then resilience is probably the response that I would lean on the most heavily, so that we're more prepared for whatever the future may throw at us, what we can predict now, or what is unpredictable. Who would have known what this year would have brought just 1.5 years ago? So that includes redundancy in the transportation system, flexibility in our actions, and a strong foundation of institution and people of the state that can respond to a variety of challenges. What I and some of my colleagues in planning are seeing this year is, I would characterize it as a lot of the trends that were already underway are clearly accelerating. A lot of these are not brand new. I was reading through some of your past annual reports, and I was struck by this introduction from 2014. It read it was from the chair at the time, in making policy and funding recommendations, we see transportation and its funding being changed by technology and communication. When I was president of the Washington Library Association from 1983 to 85, I traveled out of Walla Walla by plane or car to meetings, state and region-wide, every week. I don't do that today as chair of the commission. We transact business in person once a month and use email, teleconference, and online meetings as much as possible. Transportation will continue to evolve. Individually, we will probably travel less and use electronic devices more. As the supply chain for food, clothing, necessities, and luxuries becomes more global, we will rely on our transportation system more than ever. So that was in the introductory remarks from 2014. Sounds equally like you could characterize that today. And I think that was a theme. I went back to your very earliest annual report, and a lot of the same issues are present today. And I mention this to say that some of these things that we're seeing are not new, but they are definitely accelerating. I think we remember from the dot-com bust was the first time the demise of in-store shopping was heralded. We're hearing a lot about that today. Things have definitely accelerated this year, especially in that e-commerce and remote work and collaboration, with some challenges and a lot of opportunities in that. So I'm seeing a future with less in-person shopping for commodities, the type of goods and that are more or less the same in every store, and more of a focus on shopping for services, entertainment, and experiences. That's a trend that has been going as well, but has been put on a rocket boost this year. That results in different transportation patterns that we'll have to accommodate. Goods still get made somewhere and wind up somewhere, but would take a different path between them. That path can potentially be more efficient, but it also disrupts places, communities, business, and livelihoods in the way. So special care needs to be taken for those folks who are left behind in transitions. We have been warning about that for a long time, and specific to transportation, some of the ways to address that is looking at the distribution networks. In the land use arena, there's definitely going to be a highlight on space for distribution, warehousing, and logistics businesses. Within cities especially, need to look at curb space for deliveries, lobby space for package handling when designing buildings. There was a study in 2018 that found 1.5 deliveries per apartment per week in a 300-unit apartment complex in New Jersey. I bet that's up now. Anyone who has been to an apartment building in the last 5 years, and I'm sure again that's triply so this year and this month, you see whole piles of packages scattered about the building, and some organization could definitely help that. Same thing goes for the curb space in the public realm. The work from home seems to me to be more of a new trend, but a very significant one. Unclear how that will happen. We all have our stories from our own jobs and our own colleagues, whether this will turn into more of a hybrid system. I saw Google yesterday, and I think Google, I've seen the announcements of them this year, lead broad shifts throughout other companies. Some of the other Google and some of the other tech companies. So they announced that they're thinking strongly of 3-day work week with 2 work from home, or 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. And so you have this blend of collaborative work in person and more writing reports and whatnot done at home. So you get the best of both worlds. There's also going to be others who are completely detached from the workspace with major implications for central business districts. I think for ours, our biggest one in Seattle, there was, it had gotten a little bit crazy last year with the rents for office space, the transportation focus downtown and all that. So I think some relief from the intensity of growth and density of office work and all that might be a good thing. But too much of that would definitely be a struggle for central business district, and the same goes for the other medium-sized cities in the state. Some trends have paused this year, so I think of the sharing economy with transportation has been coming and going in fits and starts. In my community, I've gone in 2 years or so from using Car2Go and Reach Now car share services, where you pick up a car anywhere on the curb and you drop it off anywhere in the city, whenever it was too late, too far, or too diagonal to use the bus, or I was too tired. Plus, there were 3 different competing colors of bike share all around the city, and now all 5 of those are gone. And so earlier this year, we were left with 0 of these share services. But now scooters are here, and a new car share service just launched in Seattle from, I think it was Mercedes. Zipcar, I think, was the first one just about, and that has remained steady throughout. And I believe you're going to be hearing from the rideshare services, the Lyfts and the Ubers next, for some of their perspective on some of those technology disruptions. But all that to say that very dynamic new technology realm, and a cautionary tale not to rely on it too much. If you were to abandon your vehicle for Car2Go and Reach Now, you would now be left out in the cold. If you were to abandon your transit service because there was a privately available alternative, what happens when that goes away? So it's nice to see that through all of those disruptions, our transit agencies and WashDOT and local transportation departments have steadily been there through snow, pandemic, and everything else that has been thrown at them. Regardless of the pandemic, some areas still need work, have not gone anywhere, or have been steadily exacerbating. And the 3 big ones there are climate, equity, and housing. You could spend a whole series on every single one of those, and I think you are well aware of some of those challenges. So I'll just repeat that it's worth remembering that those are not going anywhere, and they are, in fact, I think all three of them getting worse as a result of the pandemic. Big challenges with budgets being hammered, especially where user fees are involved, transit service, toll revenue, major challenges, huge question about federal support to state and local governments and transit to backfill some of the lost user fee because a lot of those costs don't go away. To me, it's a factor of the revenue and financing system, but it is annoying that on the back end of recessions and other disruptions, things like transit always lag the economic indicators. So that goes both directions. Transit services overabundant when people stop going to work until it slowly ramps down, but then it's also missing when it's time to get people back to work. And it would be nice to have that those cycles a little bit more in line. So I said I was the work in our legislative committee for the chapter. Getting ready for the 2021 session is going to be an interesting one to follow. The context is we've got a budget year, so that's a major piece of work even in good times, and severely diminished legislative capacity. So working on Zoom and all that, I think we've all gotten a lot better at that than in March of this year when most people had their first introduction to online meetings. But even in the best of times, there is no substitute, I believe, for face-to-face communications or the type of high energy opening of doors and popping in and out of offices and representatives of associations loitering in hallways of the Capitol waiting for spontaneous discussions or quick group work and all that. So the overall pipeline of work available is diminished. And at the same time, we're meeting major issues to address. So those budget and financial issues, keeping folks running, households running that have lost jobs and all of that, keeping agencies running that have lost their revenue source, hopefully doing some work on climate and housing this year, and doing all of that with that diminished legislative capacity is going to be a big challenge. The state revenue forecasts for the operating budget haven't been as dire as we feared early in the year, but they are still difficult. And of course, that's meeting a whole pile of needs. And again, that uncertainty about the federal role that could really make or break our ability to deliver services and serve the public. APA's legislative priorities, we haven't finished our review for 2021, but 2020 ones for transportation are all equally valid. And I'll start by saying that there's a whole lot of overlap between the recommendations of the commission and your policy plan and in your last annual report, as I see in APA's policy positions. And that is support for a performance-based, outcome-driven transportation planning and funding process that supports the state's transportation policy goals. We have been concerned for a while in transportation planning at the state level about the impact of legislative earmarks, which are essentially what those big project lists like the Nickel and Connecting Washington packages are. The commission, WashDOT, and all the people and organizations that participate in your planning processes have put together some well-researched, well-justified, integrated transportation plans with public participation that always start with boring things like preservation, but they are excellent plans. And then that meets the kind of legislative process of picking projects that will garner enough support among the legislature. And so I do understand the need for public support, which is what the legislature is trying to craft with those project lists. But you heard a lot last couple in October from McKinsey, and they had those charts about the relative value of transportation projects and making sure you're aligning your the state's investments with the highest and best use of those funds. And the earmark process doesn't always deliver those same high priority projects. But that said, you cannot get around the need for public support. So I recognize that's a difficult one. We also support development of sustainable transportation funding sources to replace the gas tax. No news to you. Support projects and programs to significantly reduce transportation-related deaths and injuries, especially among vulnerable, lower income, and historically marginalized populations that are overrepresented in deaths, injuries, and impacted health. We support statewide requirement to evaluate and report levels of service for transit, pedestrian, and bicycle facilities. You hear a lot about concurrency, and you probably hear a lot about the exemption of state facilities from concurrency programs. That's a very thorny one, especially because of pass-through traffic and all of that. But on the multimodal side, there's definitely a challenge where providing sidewalks and bike lanes and transit service is different in a supply-demand capacity sense than roads. So it is a different process to get there. But what gets measured gets done, and I see especially reporting of level of service standards, and if possible concurrency requirements at the local level for those very important parts of the transportation system as being an important way to get some of that done. APA recently at national level adopted a surface transportation policy guide that guides planners' advocacy efforts and the work they do in their communities throughout the nation. I won't run through all of that, but I will make it available to you to peruse. Again, I think it dovetails well with the policies that you are already seeking, but there's probably some helpful information on there, and it was only recently adopted a couple of years ago. The roadmap report, I'm sure you have delved into that and participated in that process, but a lot of the recommendations that came out of that report are timely and well-designed. New fiscal tools to ensure fiscal sustainability, plans, policies, strategies, and funding for climate mitigation and adaptation, equity as a goal in growth planning, climate as a goal in growth planning, a connection between the goals of the state transportation plan and the GMA planning goals, and those multimodal performance measures within urban growth areas. I've also been participating in the Updating Washington's Growth Planning Framework project. We had the last of 11 4 or 5 hour meetings yesterday, and this is a project kind of a follow-up to the roadmap report. Transportation was not a focus of it, so I won't go too much into that process, but I think we'll have time for questions at the end. I'd be happy to talk about the nitty-gritty, and it was a great process of collaboration between a whole host of stakeholder groups, associations, and whatnot. Very difficult, had a very big list of things to tackle, including no small issues as climate and housing, periodic update timeline. So very challenging to put that together. I think we wound up right now, we've got a 47-page omnibus bill that makes 108 discrete changes to the state's growth planning framework. And we'll see how that lands with the legislature once it's finished. So I'll wrap up there. I think we'll do questions at the end of the session, but however you want to do it is fine with me. Otherwise, I believe we have Patrick Lynch next. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Patrick?
Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Lynch. I'm a principal with Transpo Group. I've been with Transpo for over 15 years now. I lead our multimodal transportation planning practice. And I also help co-lead our the transportation planning division as part of our APA Washington chapter, and I co-lead that with Michael, who will be presenting later. And so I'm just going to cover, I have a set of slides here. I think we can start to click through. So here we go. So I'm just going to cover kind of some general trends that we're seeing, and where we think these trends are going to land post-vaccine. And so obviously COVID-19 has had a dramatic impact on our transportation system in the short term. But I think the question that planners are trying to wrestle with is, what are the longer term impacts of some of the things we're experiencing now? So in order to kind of look forward, we want to look back and see what the trends were doing before. And overall, things were trending up. The modes were growing. There was growth in air travel, passenger vehicles in terms of vehicle miles traveled, and it was actually growing a little more out in the western part of the US, more than other parts. Transit was actually declining nationally in the last decade, but here in the Puget Sound region, we were actually one of the few places that was experiencing some substantial growth in transit ridership. Next slide. And part of that is due to transportation network companies coming into the picture, and some of those rides transitioning to Uber and Lyft. And those shared use transportation was really experiencing significant growth pre-pandemic, as well as micromobility in terms of e-scooters and bike share. I know some of those success stories are more localized depending on what community they were deployed in, but overall, that mode of first and last mile mobility was growing. And then truck traffic, due to e-commerce and increased deliveries, was growing at a little faster rate than passenger vehicles. And we, as transportation planners, were forecasting that to continue into the future. Next slide. And so the pandemic hits. And one of the big things that changed for a lot of us is working from home. And, before the COVID, the telework was, approximately 5% of how people worked. This chart I'm showing is produced from a study by the University of Chicago, and they were tracking the rate of telework kind of through the pandemic. And you can see at the peak, it was above 60%, and then it's started to drop since then. But really the question for planners is really, how will this end up post-vaccine? And, where do we think where the rate of telework is going to be once things start to return to normal? Next slide. One of the things that we need to consider is the length in which these stay-at-home orders have been in effect. And the longer that people are required to work from home, the greater the adoption of telework is going to be as a means of working. It just won't impact local commuting trips. It's also going to impact longer business trips, either locally, regionally, nationally. And that includes both business conferences and conventions. I think, we've been living in this virtual world, and the longer this goes on, the infrastructure to support that and the policies to support that are going to start to take a firm hold, and some of these things are going to continue on longer. Not to mention the technology that allows for remote working is going to improve in the future, as well as access to that technology. And then again, just the policies, processes, and norms of teleworking are going to be more solidified and adopted by both employees and employers. Next slide. So one of the reasons this is likely to continue on, this is a survey that was part of that University of Chicago study, and they were asking, how will behavior change post-pandemic. And not surprisingly, there's, I think, an urge to kind of return to some type of normalcy. More than half of the respondents said that, either there'd be a complete or substantial return. But what's interesting is there's about a third of the respondents that are going to be a lot more cautious about, what this new normal looks like. And so I think this is the big question, is like, once we have a vaccine, how will that change behavior? And I think there's some evidence to suggest that maybe it's going to be a slow return to normalcy. And again, this is a snapshot in time, so perceptions will change over time. But I think this is kind of where we're at now. Next slide. So the other part of that is e-commerce, and we've talked a little bit about this. York was discussing this. And so e-commerce had been growing pre-pandemic, and you can see on this chart, kind of on the right end, kind of right as the pandemic hit, as we became more dependent on online shopping, obviously that increased a lot. It has come down a little bit since then, but similar to telework, and really for all of the same reasons, that new baseline is likely to be a lot higher post-pandemic. And so I think there's a lot, as planners and, as the business community is watching to see kind of really what's going to happen with that. Next slide. I mean, what's evidence in terms of what the long-term outlook is you can look into retail lease rates. And like for instance here, Manhattan, New York City, I mean, they're experiencing some significant drops in retail lease rates. And so I think there's a suggestion from the business community that they're rethinking kind of the physical retail spaces and really kind of waiting to see how things kind of shake out once the dust settles with kind of this new baseline of e-commerce. And it's really, how will, consumer habits be changed by this as people become more comfortable with online shopping? What are the land use implications of this for retail centers? How does this change trip making, deliveries? There's a whole bunch of questions. I mean, and one of the things that we're really tracking, pre-pandemic, autonomous vehicles were really being pushed by some of these delivery service providers, and that trend could accelerate as a result of the pandemic. I think there may be, as e-commerce becomes a bigger share of retail sales, that could accelerate the development of autonomous vehicles for delivering goods. Next slide, please. But maybe nothing was hit harder by the pandemic than public transit. And we've seen some significant ridership declines across the U.S. Here in King County, Metro kind of has seen about 2/3 of their riders drop off, and what has been left is really an indication of what this transit dependent population. So there is still people that are very reliant on public transportation, and these larger transit agencies are more affected by the loss in ridership, and it's really dependent on their the fare box revenue and how they fund service. So not all transit agencies are affected the same, and really depending on how they're funded. But we've really seen some of the larger agencies have to make changes to service, both in terms of service hours and routes, which really hits that transit dependent population and economic disadvantaged population the hardest. Ride hailing services also saw a drop in ridership. And this is what the chart is showing is just the stock price of Uber. And I wanted to share that because although we don't know exactly how ride hailing services are going to weather the pandemic, I think there's an indication here that their fortunes are maybe a little different than public transit. You can see towards the end of the chart that the stock prices have been increasing. And I think that's an indication that that investors see a more resilient recovery from these companies because they're a little more flexible and they've been able to kind of change their business model a little bit during this. You know, for instance, Uber, who the majority of their business was providing rides, you know, we're able to switch to food delivery to kind of help fill in that hole. And so they see that flexibility as a way of them being more resilient to some of these disruptions. But ultimately, as planners, we're really interested to see how this kind of change in mobility is going to affect land use and densities, especially in our downtown areas. Next slide, please. One of the more interesting things, I think, and I know maybe some of our other speakers will speak to this a little more in depth, but we've seen our roadways become more dangerous during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And this is due to, we've observed, you know, higher speeds. We've also observed less seatbelt use and an increase in alcohol and drug use. Next slide, please, if you can get to the next slide. Yeah, this slide right here. So what the chart on the left shows are, you know, person ejections from auto crashes. So the people thrown from the vehicle, and it's an indicator of the severity of the accident, and it's also an indicator of both speed and seatbelt use. And so you can see between 2019 and 2020, kind of pre-pandemic, the lines are pretty much overlapping. But once the stay-at-home orders became effective, you can see how the increase in severity of the crashes increased. And so there, you know, I don't have a lot of conclusions on why this is occurring. I think we'll see more studies on this from both the transportation community as well as the insurance community. I think we'll be looking into this to see kind of what was creating this kind of more dangerous situation on the roads. But I think there's a lot of theories on what this might be, why this might be happening. But this is something to keep an eye on moving forward. Next slide. So really, I want to leave you with these kind of 5 kind of, you know, key takeaways. First is the stickiness of telework and e-commerce as trip substitutions. How is this going to impact our transportation system? You know, we're likely to see a less pronounced peak hour, and as well less reliant on the network for commuting in some ways. But the degree in which that's going to occur, we need to really keep an eye on. As planners, we really want to see what are the impacts to land use in both commercial, retail, and residential. You know, will people have more freedom to select communities with more affordable housing if they're not tethered to their job site as much? And how will that affect office space and retail space? So there are some big questions related to land use and real estate. Parking and curbside pickup played an important role during COVID for businesses. That kind of being able to use that space in a flexible way was really key. And so key policy decisions around the curbside in particular are going to be important and an important focus of planners moving forward. And then I think for transit, we'll be looking at, understanding that transit is still very important as part of our transportation system, but how we might refocus it less on peak hour commuting and more on just as a means of mobility for this, essential workers, transit dependent population, those that are still reliant on it, that have been reliant on it during the pandemic and will continue to be reliant on it post-pandemic. And we'll watch to see how these choice riders come back to public transit as the vaccine is deployed and things start to return to normal. But I think, there's a wait and see to see what happens there. And then an area that maybe was really exposed during the pandemic has been social equity. It really shone a spotlight on really the importance of transit as the backbone for mobility. Even with the decreases in ridership, it's really important as a means of creating more access to opportunity for these kind of economically disadvantaged populations and transit-dependent groups. And so that is one thing as planners. I think equity is going to be a big theme in these next round of long-range transportation plans, and as we kind of look to see how everything is going to shake out long-term. So with that, I will end my presentation, and we'll look forward to questions at the end of the speakers here.
All right. Michael, are you up next?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Let me share my screen here. Great. Thank you all. My name is Michael Hintz. I'm just a clarification to Roy's introduction. I'm the Director of Planning for Tool Design in Seattle. I'm not the Director of Planning for Seattle. And I'm also, as Patrick mentioned, one of the co-liaisons for the Transportation Planning Division to the Washington chapter of APA. Tool Design is a planning and engineering firm specializing in multimodal transportation systems that contribute to a thriving, diverse community centered around people. So Yorick and Patrick provided a great big picture overview of what transportation might look like post-COVID. And I'm very pleased to be here with you today to drill down a little further and discuss how transportation systems support resilient communities with a focus on trends in our public rights-of-way that we've seen during the pandemic and how these can be sustained post-COVID. So the pandemic has revealed a lot in terms of where our institutions and systems are falling short. And as far as transportation goes, it is underscored, goodness me, what's going on here? Really underscored the need for a more equitable multimodal approach. Hold on one second. I'm sorry about this. I think I'm going to have to share my PDF instead. Not sure why that's happening. All right. And I apologize for the background noise as well. I got some construction going on in my house, working from home, isn't it lovely? Great. So hopefully, goodness, man. Sorry about this. Okay. Are you gonna, can you pull up my slides? That would be wonderful. I think that might get us there. Okay. Great. So back where I was at, sorry about that, technical difficulties. I think we've all experienced those. So as I was saying, the pandemic has revealed a lot in terms of where our institutions and systems are falling short. And as far as transportation goes, it's underscored the need for more equitable, multimodal approach that many policymakers, planners, designers, and advocates have been promoting well before the pandemic. And in order to respond to the many challenges facing our communities, such as climate change, funding shortfalls, and yes, potentially even future pandemics, we really do need to think in terms of resiliency. Transportation has a large role to play in supporting community resiliency. And Yorick mentioned aspects of transportation resiliency, such as redundancy. I want to focus on these elements of transportation systems. Equity, flexibility, proximity, and support. These are all supported by a data-driven approach that leverages both old and new technologies and ways of thinking. So I want to talk about some trends that we've seen during the pandemic that support resiliency and the impact these trends may have on our transportation systems post-pandemic. Next slide, please.
I think we're having some technical difficulties. Your slides are not displaying at the moment, but I think we're pulling them up.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I thought you'd already done that.
I think these are my slides though, Michael. Yeah. I don't think we've seen your slides yet.
Oh,
they were showing, yeah, the my slide deck.
Okay. Let me see here. Yeah, I don't seem to have controls. Oh, here we go. Okay, so Bobby, it looks like you're in control now. Okay, so do you have my, I'm sorry about this. Bobby, do you have my slide deck? There we go. Okay, if you could just advance to the third slide. Wonderful, thank you. Last slide, previous slide, please. So when the pandemic hit, many communities were scrambling to scale an appropriate transportation response. People stopped traveling to work, travel patterns changed overnight. People were staying home and needing opportunities to safely recreate outside. The transportation needs of essential workers became paramount. Transit agencies struggled to adapt, as Patrick alluded to, and businesses saw a dramatic drop in business. So fantastic guides like the one on this screen, one from NACTO on the right and one from Seattle, King County, came out when we were already several months into the lockdown. And they provide great strategies for repurposing streets to allow for safe travel and support the activities of businesses that rely on in-person transactions. The guides present low-cost strategies focused on pandemic response and recovery, which can just as easily be applied in a post-pandemic world. Next slide, please. Just one example of repurposing on-street parking so that sidewalks can support dining. Even while 4 out of 10 restaurants have closed across the US, strategies like this have been instrumental in keeping many restaurants in business. Next slide, please. Another configuration where the dining is put in the street, keeping the sidewalks clear for people to walk and go to businesses safely. Next slide, please. Many communities have established easy permitting process to allow businesses to quickly adapt and utilize space that's normally set aside for on-street parking, and even in some cases parking lots for many kinds of activities just beyond dining, including gyms, yoga, and outdoor displays. Next slide, please. And communities have created safe streets with restricted motor vehicle access to provide more space for people to walk, bike, and interact safely. Some communities have kept these safe and healthy streets in place. They're establishing new norms that can carry over into post-COVID times. These are my kids on a safe and healthy street here in Seattle, not far from our house. And Seattle itself is planning to make a good number of these streets permanent with more permanent infrastructure. Next slide, please. Other cities have really seized the opportunity of decreased traffic to try new things. This is a shot from the city of Pullman, where they implemented a demonstration project of a protected bike lane on Main Street in downtown Pullman. It was a project that came out of their recently adopted downtown master plan. Prior to this pilot, there were no bike lanes in downtown. The pilot removed a traffic lane, reoriented parallel parking to back-in angle parking, and provides an important low-stress connection to downtown businesses. It was implemented at a cost of less than $5,000. Next slide, please. And this is an image I stole from Dong Ho Chang's Twitter feed, but this is 4th Avenue in downtown Seattle. It's one of the last remaining gaps in Seattle's Center City Bike Network. And its implementation pre-COVID was challenging due to traffic and loading demands along the corridor. So SDOT took advantage of new traffic conditions to get the protected bike lane installed using a flexible design with paint and post, and they'll be evaluating the facility over time to see how well it works with all other users. Next slide, please. So we've seen some positive transportation trends during the pandemic, whether it's reallocation of street space to other uses and modes, using streets to support economic activity, a focus on essential workers' transportation needs, meeting the recreation and physical activity needs of residents. So I now want to shift to talking about how many of these strategies and others can contribute to more resilient communities in the post-pandemic world. Next slide, please. So even before the pandemic, it was well understood that decades of prioritizing the automobile and ignoring the needs of disadvantaged communities resulted in gross inequities in transportation investments. And more cities are taking into account the people moving capacity of different travel modes when deciding how best to allocate limited street space and funding. Now we're seeing more red bus lanes popping up, bike lanes, replacing general purpose lanes and parking lanes in urban and suburban communities alike. Now Market Street in San Francisco, which is the image on the right, may be an extreme example, but it is a clear illustration of how the graphic on the left is put into practice. That graphic shows the people moving capacity of various forms of transportation on the left-hand side, being the automobile, people, and then the bicycle next to that, walking, and then finally transit on the far right. Now, thinking about street space allocation in this way advances equity by providing more low-cost transportation options to more people. It's really about getting the biggest bang for the buck in terms of moving people and connecting activity centers while supporting other goals such as reducing greenhouse gases, improving public health, and yes, really supporting community resiliency. Next slide, please. Now, flexibility is really key to meeting the ever-changing demands of our streets and transportation landscape. So while not a cure-all solution, technology does have a critical role in the design and operation of our street system. Digital signage and integrated navigation apps can communicate real-time information on speed limits, lane closures, curb space availability, and traffic management tools that utilize low-cost sensors, machine learning simulation models, and adaptive traffic signals can optimize flow or prioritize certain modes of travel at certain times of day, allowing for a really flexible transportation system. Now, as has been demonstrated in previous slides and can be seen in communities around Washington, the use of low-cost infrastructure allows for flexible street design that can be adjusted based on performance and community feedback. And then finally, portable infrastructure such as movable street furniture, parklets, etc., allow for quick, relatively low-cost adaptation of street space for features that support businesses and other community needs. Next slide, please. So communities shouldn't be afraid to experiment and use data to evaluate effectiveness of new approaches to street design, managing the right-of-way, and traffic safety. Data-driven evaluation can dispel entrenched assumptions. Typically, all it's needed is a few months to determine if something really works. And there are new relatively low-cost technologies available to help communities collect data that could be useful for evaluating these new approaches. Going back to Pullman, for projects like this, pictured on the left there, it's really important to gather data such as travel times of all modes, tax receipts from adjacent businesses, number of bicyclists using the facility, number of crashes occurring in the corridor, and use this data to either justify maintaining the change, modifying the change, or doing away with it altogether and trying something different. So technology and data can be used to manage curb space. The image in the middle is from Aspen, Colorado. In Aspen, they significantly increased the cost of parking in downtown in order to discourage driving, encourage more parking turnover, and support downtown improvements. That change, much to many people thought that was going to really deter people from going downtown, but in fact, it led to a 17% increase in sales tax revenue from downtown businesses, which got formerly resistant businesses on board with the new pricing. And finally, as Patrick mentioned, how during the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in certain types of crashes, and particularly related to speeding is among the top 3 contributing factors to fatal crashes in Washington and around the country. So we've seen during an increase in speed-related fatalities. We know the best way to reduce these types of crashes is to design our streets in a way that encourage slower travel speeds and moving away from the 85th percentile method. It's even been found that simply changing the posted speed can be effective at lowering operating speeds in some cases. But again, experimentation with data-driven evaluation is really key to all this. Next slide, please. And then finally, proximity is perhaps the most important component of a resilient community, particularly as work from home is likely to continue as a trend post-COVID, as Patrick mentioned. And being able to meet most, if not all, of our daily needs without having to travel far distances and using modes such as walking, biking, other micromobility removes much of the demand on our transportation systems. The pandemic has certainly underscored how important proximity is. The Growth Management Act encourages urban planning approaches that concentrate growth in urban areas to allow efficient provision of services, reduce sprawl, promote physical activity, and support transportation choices. So the idea of 15 or 20-minute neighborhoods, not a new idea. The image on the right shows the features of a 20-minute neighborhood, which includes local shopping, local health facilities, recreational opportunities, local public transit, and safe cycling networks, just among other features. But all these features contribute to a resilient communities that allow people to age in place, reduce their transportation cost, and their carbon footprint. Many communities are planning this way. The image on the left is from the city of Kirkland, where they've mapped destinations throughout the city to determine what areas of the city have some or all of the features of a 20-minute neighborhood. And this is informing their planning and infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. So I really want to thank you for your time, and I wish I could have had more of it because there's really so much more to say, but I look forward to questions, and I hope I've at least provided a few ideas of what resilient transportation systems post-COVID might look like and how communities in the state of Washington can advance such systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, you ready?
I am ready, and hopefully my slides are available, or at least I can try to use the screen share here. Oh, it's telling me somebody else has it. Okay, let's try this one more time. And hopefully everybody will be able to see my slides. Can people see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. So you've heard from Yorick and Patrick and Michael, and you've had a really big
I'm sorry,
picture.
Chris, just a minute. You are not in presentation mode.
I'm sorry, is that better?
No, we just went to your, so we're seeing your presenter screen, not your actual
hold on.
slides.
Let me try this one more time. How about now? Is that working better?
Beautiful.
Okay, great. All right, so let me just continue. You've heard from others, had a pretty big picture look at what's going on with transportation and land use. And my job is to just try to bring it down one more layer and drill down a little bit more and show you what we've kind of been observing here in Northwest Washington, not necessarily Bellingham specific. I am the immediate past president of the Northwest section of APA Washington. And so that includes Whatcom, Skagit, Island, and San Juan counties. You're going to see a lot of information from Bellingham, but a lot of these will also translate to these other places in our Northwest section. So let me jump right in. Okay, so I'm going to start with the beginning of the pandemic. Everything that we had known before COVID suddenly changed in March. And we immediately saw vehicle traffic volumes plunge and the border close for us. And you'll see this throughout my presentation. It's a huge deal for the entire Northwest section. It's estimated that about 20% of daily trips just into Bellingham and Whatcom County are from Lower Mainland, BC. We also saw transit ridership plunge locally. I don't have the numbers for Skagit Transit, but I believe they were hit equally as bad. Across the board, airline travel was down, as well as rail travel. We interestingly, as spring changed to summer, we saw recreation increase, outdoor recreation, and in particular, walking and biking. And of course, this was related to people just going absolutely stir crazy, wanting to get out of their homes and then needing ways to get to places, walking and biking. As you saw from some of the previous presentations, interesting adaptations occurred, including here in Bellingham and other places in the Northwest section. By May, we had started to see that there were going to be big financial impacts from this. We are still trying to figure out what that's going to look like, but everybody's budgets are being impacted by this throughout the Northwest section. Cities and counties are trying to finalize their budgets for 2021. Of course, there's going to be need for major adjustments. Thankfully, there appears to be a vaccine that will become increasingly available over the next couple of months and into the spring and summer. But until it's widely available, things are going to remain suppressed. Just to kind of put a fine point on it for Bellingham in particular, and this of course translates to Mount Vernon, Burlington, Anacortes, all these other places in the Northwest section. We're a regional center, as are some of these other cities, and we rely on people coming in and out of our city every single day. It's like the tide going in and out, and this is true for cities across Washington. And so we take an inordinate amount of transportation impact from around the region into our cities, but it also helps us financially. And as I mentioned, we're heavily reliant on Canadian visitors, and we would very much like them to come back. But we won't see that for quite some time. The Prime Minister has made it clear that until things get better in the United States, that people from the US are simply not going to be able to cross and visit Canada. And that means that Canadians won't be able to come visit us either. To put an even finer point on it, and this is very depressing for me in particular, Whatcom County and Bellingham in general has really seen an absolute cessation of visitation. You can see, I don't expect you to be able to read the detail here in the text, but you can see on the graph that on the upper portion of the graph, the black jagged lines, it's like a heartbeat in medical terms. This is non-essential trips across the border, passenger vehicles. And then the red line you can see at the bottom of the graph in medical terms has just flatlined. There is no visitation. It's not happening. It's having significant impacts in the Whatcom and Skagit region. Freight trucking, thankfully, is still considered an essential function. And so freight trucks are able to come across the border, and that's critical for our economy and making goods and services available. So that's a good thing, and hopefully we'll see some improvement in that as well. It's almost back to normal levels. As you've heard from other presenters, transit ridership here locally has plummeted, as well as across the state and the country. In orange here, you can see that back in March 2020, things were going just fine, and then the pandemic hit, and you can see how things unfolded there. And the blue line, you can see how that looked last year. And you see some big dips, and that's because the universities here go on spring break, typically at the end of March and beginning of April. Well, university is incredibly important to transit. In fact, Western Washington University typically contributes to about 40% of WTA's overall transit ridership. The students have voted to pay for transit passes as part of their tuition, so they rely on it heavily. And because school's not in session, there's no on-campus presence of students, transit has suffered greatly. And as you heard from other presenters, ridership has been limited. WTA and other transit agencies are limited to about 12 passengers per bus, with passengers loading in the rear doors, the driver sealed off from other passengers to protect them. And it's really, you know, the riders of choice have really moved away from transit, and it's really carrying essential workers and transit dependent people. This is what things look like today, or at least in April. You can see that it just flatlined, and ridership is at a very low level. It has recovered to some extent, but we're still seeing very low levels of ridership. And I kind of think that this is going to be the biggest challenge for transit, not just in 2021, but going forward, is to recapture those riders of choice. As you've heard from other presenters, you know, we've seen these trends unfolding. We still don't know how they're going to play out. But cities are dependent on a lot of these things. Here in this graph, you can see the vehicle miles traveled. And this is from Streetlight data, part of the big data that's available these days. And this is for for Whatcom County. And what you can see is what happened in March and April, and then the slow recovery into the summer months. As summer came on, people again wanted to get out. They were leery of getting on airplanes or trains or buses, and they opted to get in their own cars. And so we saw a return to travel by personal vehicle. And we are pretty much back to almost normal levels. And I would say that not just here in the Northwest section, but across Washington, this is probably true. Here's just an example of some of this big data. This is reporting what the VMT looked like back in March before there was the lockdown orders. And we're just under 3 million vehicle miles traveled. All of a sudden, April 1st, this plummets by about 70% or so. And this was significant. It's something that we had not seen before. And then we get to today, December, and this is what it looks like. We're about 2.5 million vehicle miles traveled, and that's getting very close to back to normal. And it's very understandable if you think about a lot of the things going on. I'm not going to read through a lot of these slides, but this is just information to kind of ponder. You know, as I've mentioned, transit ridership is still down. This is where things are at today. Air and rail travel still down. Walking and biking is pretty much stable. We did see the increases over the summer months. It was primarily recreational purposes and local travel rather than, you know, transportation related from a, say, commute to work standpoint. That, of course, has to do with the work from home phenomenon. We've seen vehicle traffic increasing. Like I said, we're almost back to normal. Unfortunately for us, the border remains closed and will remain closed for quite some time. This has led me to ask the question and really ponder some scenarios for our future in the Northwest section. As all of you, and I know myself and others have done throughout this pandemic, we've all made adjustments to our daily living and our daily travel patterns. And we have figured out different things that work for ourselves individually and our families and our communities. And I've wondered if the border reopens, let's say in spring of 2021, based on all the adjustments that people have made, what if the Canadians decide that they don't need to come back down to the Northwest section for non-essential trips? What if they've made adjustments? What if they've figured out that they don't need to come down to the United States to buy things like they had been? There's some things that are probably going to always attract them, such as gasoline, which is priced significantly lower here than in Canada. There's many retail goods that don't carry the same taxes, but as I mentioned, they may have found ways to adjust. And as a result, the funding mechanisms that we've set up here in the Northwest section, Bellingham in particular, but you know, all over Washington, cities are highly reliant on sales tax revenue generation. And maybe there will be conversations and questions asked about the sustainability of some of these funding mechanisms, and open up conversations about other ways to fund and create more resilient and sustainable funding mechanisms that can weather disruptive events like the pandemic or other economic turndowns. Back to, you know, the main theme here in terms of big themes that we're seeing, you can see that there may be an increase in single occupant vehicle use. And this is because it offers a way for people to get out away from their homes where they've been locked down for a long time, get out, experience the beauty of Washington State and other places. It allows them to go pick up goods and services curbside. And increasingly we're seeing delivery trips. So after things return to a more regular situation, I don't know that we can say normal, we may very well see more vehicle miles traveled going forward. This, of course, has big impacts to land use, and we may very well see significant adjustments and changes from a land use standpoint. You've heard from Patrick and Michael about some of the things that they've been seeing as consultants. And we're certainly seeing this here, you know, employees working from home and shifting from online versus in-person shopping for goods and services, less people driving in general to take kids to school, university students and public school students learning online. These are things that are at the present time gutting our downtowns and our urban centers. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this translates in the next several years. There are some potentially positive things coming out of this as well. More complete pedestrian and bicycle connections. You saw Michael profile some of those. Increasing popularity of electric bikes, possibility of more bike share when it becomes safe to do so, and transforming the fossil fuel powered societal fleet of vehicles to more electric based forms of transportation. I will just let you know, I'm pleased to announce that this morning, Bellingham has officially been designated as a gold level bicycle friendly community by the League of American Bicyclists. We're very proud of that. There's other cities in the Northwest section that have been designated as bicycle friendly communities. Anacortes is one. But that's another sign that we're doing a lot of things to try to support non-vehicular travel in our cities and trying to create people-centered transportation systems rather than strictly vehicle-centered. So we're working on those things. And as I've mentioned, some of the trends we're seeing unfold, but don't yet know how they're going to play out completely. Untethered office workers are moving from very high-cost housing markets into places that are more lifestyle-oriented. They can work from these places they want to be. It's creating interesting impacts to the housing markets, the employment markets. It's having interesting impacts on the transportation system. Commercial development, you heard Patrick talk a little bit about this, is in relatively low demand, and at our downtown centers are being heavily impacted. Retail and restaurants in particular are suffering mightily. And a lot of businesses have in fact closed and may not ever open their doors again. It really brings up some interesting questions about what might happen to some of these spaces. Can they be easily converted? What will happen? How does that relate to what kind of trip generation occurs, or what kind of economic base there can be to support the opening of new businesses? It may change things significantly. And there's a big question about personal mobility. What will that look like a few years from now? There's also interesting things happening in the retail goods sector of the economy, in particular grocery stores. You know, a lot of us, most of us maybe, are doing curbside pickup or having things delivered to our homes. And this is going to result in some interesting land use impacts in terms of what happens at these places where we all go to collect the things that we need to have the lifestyles that we like. And perhaps the future of grocery stores is primarily as distribution centers, rather than just a place where it's almost a pseudo-social place to go and have an interesting experience. That's it from me, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go. But this was just an opportunity to offer you kind of a more local glimpse of what's happening in a particular part of Washington that may have some unique characteristics and be impacted in ways other cities aren't, such as the border and other things. So anyway, thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer question with all the other presenters in the main question answer session.
Okay, and just for the record, we are a little bit behind schedule. So we will take questions, but please keep it short and sweet. Are there any questions for the panel? Any questions? Rima.
This was great, you guys. So many things I could ask, but I wanted to ask Michael two things. One is on the parking pricing information you touched on. And I'm just wondering, we've heard about this from in other presentations, and wondering what consideration or data maybe there is out there. There's more parking pricing approaches cities are taking to limit the amount of traffic coming into their downtowns. is there data that shows there's any impacts in terms of an access issue? So, if you live in an area where maybe there's not great transit access, and you need to go into downtown, if parking is priced at a level that you can't afford, is that impacting people's access to downtowns? Is my one question for Michael.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Rima. I think, it really will depend on context. Certainly in places that are not, don't have as rich a transit infrastructure, that could be the case. And that may also, those contexts may also be the types of contexts where, you may not have an overwhelming number of demand for parking in those areas. But I would say, generally it could impact access. The example I gave in Aspen, it's obviously a ski town, a lot of visitors. So I think they were also taking advantage of that aspect of the visitors coming to downtown and kind of clogging up downtown. And they saw an opportunity to kind of use pricing as a way to shift behaviors.
Okay, thank you.
Esther?
Thanks. Thank you all for the really interesting presentations. I heard a little bit about economic equity, and I'm wondering, kind of given the renewed racial reckoning we've been having this year, how the APA and or your individual organizations are approaching racial equity in your work, and whether that's your approach, your policies or programs, and kind of this notion that a lot of Black and brown folks don't feel safe in public spaces.
Who are you addressing it to?
All of them.
Okay.
Anyone that wants to answer.
I'll chime in really quick. We have one of those national APA policy guides that is about 20 pages worth of analysis and policy positions on. That was the very last one from last year. So APA takes that very seriously. I think you can put it into two major buckets. One is participation, so making sure that all voices are heard and all voices are heard effectively. There's a famous hierarchy of engagement opportunities, from checking a box, yes, we sent out a notice, to real, true listening and participation. And so pushing it down that ladder of participation, or up the ladder to more effective participation and engagement, is one major piece of that. And then disparate impacts. I mentioned that in terms of the health impacts that fall disproportionately on minority groups, different age groups, disability, and all of those things, and taking a special attention to helping with that. And then also the provision of new services. So, you have where you have lacking of sidewalks, where you have unsafe road conditions, where you have concentrations of pollution, trying to make sure that you reduce the disparate impact of those. So APA definitely takes that seriously, and there's a lot of details. I will make that policy guide available to the commission as well.
Thank you. And Debbie, you'll be last.
Thank you. This is partly a comment, but I'd appreciate the reflections of any of the speakers. I was especially noticing Chris's comments that vehicle miles traveled are almost back to normal, in spite of no travel from the Canadian border, which was originally a big part of their business, and in spite of a lot of work from home. And it strikes me that vehicle miles traveled that may be composed of a different set of travelers for different reasons. If we're going to get back to original miles, despite lack of commuting to work. So I think that'll be an interesting trend for the future. And I'd like to hear if anyone else has a response to that.
I'd like to just chime in real quick, and I'll keep mine short so others can share. But I think one thing that we're definitely seeing happen is people making, discretionary trips just because they can, and just to get out of their houses out of sheer boredom. There's also some research starting to show that, whereas we used to have a lot of trip chaining going on. When people were leaving work, they might stop at a few locations on the way home. Well, now people are starting to make all sorts of trips just because they can. You know, they just get in their car and go. And like I said, I think for some people, they're just getting in their cars and getting out there and looking at a different view or horizon than what they've been staring at through the window of their house. I think that's part of what's going on, but a lot of it has to do with the aversion to group travel type modes. And it's very interesting, and we'll certainly keep our eye on it. And that's enough for me.
I'll just add on a little bit to that. I mean, I think part of what you're seeing is somewhat what Chris described, and I think Michael alluded to it as well, is that some of the commute trips have been substituted with these shorter daily non-peak trips. You know, so I think as we're kind of working from home, we're making kind of more kind of shorter trips. Like those have increased, and they've increased like in the non-peak hours. And so, you know, I too, I think, especially in Whatcom County, to see that VMT increase as much as it has there, to be almost kind of where it was pre-pandemic is I think pretty surprising. But I think there's some of these trips that were taking transit before using their own personal vehicle. I think it's this kind of increase in shorter trips that is sort of, you know, and when we look at the daily travel patterns, it's sort of balancing. It's just that a lot of these trips aren't occurring at peak hour anymore, like they used to be, the morning and afternoon peak hour. And that's like what I was discussing, is like, that's what we're really interested as planners is, you know, we're interested to see how VMT is impacted, but really transportation planning has been focused on the commute peak hour in terms of capacity constraints. And so really interested to see how teleworking, e-commerce, others are affecting that peak hour congestion, and, you know, how does that change the way we develop projects?
Thank you.
Thank you. York, Patrick, Michael, Chris, I want to thank you for coming before us today. I'm sorry that I had to cut off the questions, but we're about 30 minutes behind at this point. Your presentations will be helpful as we go forward. And commissioners, if you have additional questions, please send them to the staff and they'll pass them along to York, Patrick, Michael, and Chris. Again, thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear about rideshare service perspectives from Caleb Weber, Public Policy US West Uber Technologies, and Chris Thomas, Senior Director, Public Policy Lyft.
Hello, everybody. My name is Caleb Weaver. I run public policy and communications for Uber for the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. So I cover 7 states that include Washington. So happy to be here today. Appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. Let me share my screen. Oh, I think somebody else is sharing. Okay. All right. Okay. Hopefully you all can see that. Let me know if you can't. So I'll jump right in and I will try and move quickly as I know we're a bit behind schedule. So look, as this group knows, we stand at just a really fascinating moment for transportation planning. We continue to face decades-long trends and challenges that, you know, I think everybody here has been working to respond to and get ahead of for years. And then, you know, the subject of today's conversation, you know, 2020 not only introduced a global pandemic that upended transportation systems and needs around the world, but here in the United States, you know, we've also faced a long past due reckoning around the harms of systemic racism, including in our transportation system, on Black and Brown communities. So look, it's no secret that the pandemic has caused a massive reduction in demand for our rideshare services. But here at Uber, we are really confident, and this is backed up by data from the cities and countries that have begun to open up, at least for a time, that people are going to continue to get around their communities again when we put COVID behind us. And while they may not move at the same times or go to the exact same places as they have in the past, the fundamental transportation challenges really aren't going away. So the question becomes, how do we build back better, right? How can we seize this opportunity to build an inclusive, sustainable transportation system that really meets the needs of the communities in a post-COVID world? So, that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes chatting about here. And to do that, I think, really want to start back by being very clear about what we see as the foundational challenges. So moving to the next slide. So look, the base, right, the population is rapidly urbanizing. Even if the pandemic shifts uses of downtown cores, the reality is we are going to continue to face rapidly growing cities over the next several decades. And in this process of urbanization, we are destroying the very places where we are moving, and at the same time, destroying the climate. And in transportation, those things come together, right? Where transportation is unfortunately playing a key role in the destruction of the environment. CO2 emissions from transportation already account for about a quarter of the global total, and higher in some places like Washington, and have been growing faster than any other end-use sector. So the challenge that we face is, seems almost impossible in some ways. That over the next few decades, we need to make room for mobility demand to more than double in our communities, and at the same time, cut transportation's climate emissions by more than half from today's levels. And transportation, I think, as we all know, remains one of the most difficult to decarbonize. It's the only sector with growing emissions in OECD countries. And the consequences from transportation's over-reliance on fossil fuel personal vehicle use, accounting for more than 60% of global ground travel. And there's no longer any doubt that the costs of the infrastructure that we've built have been disproportionately borne by communities of color. So to meet climate, social, and economic goals, we really have to repurpose current infrastructure for maximum efficiency, as well as social impact, and build new where necessary. So I want to be clear, Uber is a technology company, but we are very clear-eyed that technology alone is not going to solve this problem. We should not, we cannot replicate the current car-dominant environment that we have today. And instead, we have to build to meet people really where they are. So we know that this is going to have to be a combined effort between the public sector, the private sector, and advocacy communities to make this transition happen. So how do we build these inclusive, sustainable transportation systems that transform our streets, indeed transform our communities? We need to build communities around the people that live in them, all of the people that live in them, not the things that we use to get around. And look, this is a huge challenge, but we are really excited to be a part of this work, I think with everybody here, to really seize this moment and make it happen. So how do we actually do it? So we share the vision, I think, put forward by a few others already this morning, and I imagine yesterday as well, that the most effective and fastest way that we can begin to make this change is to get people out of their single occupancy vehicles and into shared sustainable modes of transportation, starting with mass transit, shared rides, and electric micromobility being the options that are currently available. And we believe Uber can help make that happen. But Uber, as I said, Uber can only help. A sustainable, inclusive system, as you can see from this chart, it's grounded in a strong public transit system. Uber has supported investments in mass transit around the world, including efforts like ST3 here in Washington, because we understand and believe in the value of mass transit. And I think something that's become abundantly clear this year is that among the key reasons we must invest in transit is how critical it is to creating truly equitable communities. But also note though, however, there is extensive evidence that mass transit is most successful as part of a broader ecosystem of transportation options. Indeed, the cities with the most robust mass transit systems have nearly always had a reliable for-hire network to provide necessary certainty that transportation is always available whenever needed. Think New York, Chicago, London. And this is where rideshare comes in. On-demand transportation helps people use transit. Right now, on-demand rides are at less than 1% of all trips. This is the insurance of a successful transport system. And then on top of that, as you can see, it's facilitating the use of micromobility and other potential future transportation options will be critical in further reducing reliance on cars and enabling us to truly transform cities. So this includes micromobility covering, that 1 to 3 mile distance, scooters on the shorter end of that, bikes on the longer end. And cities have to be walkable and accessible. Walking, obviously, not only the most sustainable form of transportation, but if enabled properly, helps build stronger, inclusive communities. So how can Uber facilitate this? And in a minute, I'll get to some of the areas where we believe that government can really play a key role in driving this change. But how can Uber help? So first, by directly supporting transit, which is going to be obviously particularly critical in light of the budget challenges facing mass transit currently. So as transit agencies look at how to reduce costs and adjust service to meet new needs, we are helping to push riders to transit by putting it right in the app and making it easy to build transit into every single trip. And we're directly partnering with transit agencies around the country, indeed around the world, to extend transit's reach and fill gaps created by budget challenges. So we have partnerships, just to name a few here, in Raleigh, North Carolina, providing, subsidized transit riders with first last mile connections in Pinellas County in Florida to help low-income late-night workers have access to accessible transportation when the agency was unable to continue overnight service. And then in the Dallas area with DART to providing North Texas riders with more options in certain areas. And again, the financial impact in these partnerships has been really to reduce the burden on transit agencies to enable them to continue to provide as many services as possible. In the space of micromobility, we are facilitating and supporting increased use of micromobility for short trips that don't require a car, trying to make it as easy as possible to string together bike and scooters with transit or other shared car trips. And as noted a few minutes ago, rideshare, functions as this insurance system for transit, providing service across the community to everyone at all times, filling in where transit is unable to meet people's needs. We can also relieve budget pressure on transit agencies by providing typically very expensive services for transit at a much lower cost. And here you can see a few of the ways that we can support vulnerable communities at a much lower cost than what most transit agencies are currently paying to provide many of these services. And importantly, using our technology can help expand options for people who are blind or have low vision, are deaf or hard of hearing, or just need an extra helping hand. So, again, the point being that the technology really can help solve some of these pinch points that have existed and invest and help transit agencies invest where they really need to right now. But enabling this multimodal system again is only possible through partnerships across transportation systems and government, and achieving this kind of transformative change. And again, we do believe that we have an opportunity right now to build back better. Will involve a series of steps by government agencies and the public at large. So we, at the top of that list is continued investments in mass transit, creating transit ways and open street networks, repurposing roads, expanding space dedicated to bikes, buses, and shared mobility services to really encourage, prioritize people that are making smarter decisions, curbside preference for greener and shared vehicles, and removing on and off street parking to really, again, drive that transition. So I've talked a lot about sort of the move to multimodal, but I wanted to really double click for a second on the critical importance from our perspective on making this transformation a truly green one. So Uber has made a public commitment to being a stronger partner in the fight against climate change. We believe it's our responsibility to more aggressively help tackle this challenge. And so earlier this year, we issued a report. And as we have learned in the past, we believe progress starts by taking an honest look at where we are today and sharing results to drive accountability. So we released our first ever climate assessment and performance report back in September. We are the only ride-sharing company, one of the first broadly, to measure and report on emissions from customers' real-world use of our products. So our report, we used real-world data from nearly 4 billion rides facilitated by our platform in the US and Canada from 2017 to 2019. It is a long report. It's more accessible than some of its type. And certainly, if anybody's interested, I encourage you to read through the whole thing. But for purposes of time here, I wanted to highlight one of the key findings around the carbon intensity of different modes of transportation. And again, we didn't pull any punches on ourselves here. We rideshare today. There are some good things. We are less carbon intensive than rides in single occupancy vehicles, as one might imagine, as well as in traditional taxis. However, we are more carbon intensive than bus, rail, or van pool services by mass transit. And for us, that's a call to action. And quite frankly, a roadmap on how we can make transportation more sustainable. And so, look, for us, we saw that as a call to action that we need to get rideshare drivers into electric vehicles. And we see, again, tremendous opportunity here. That when we help higher utilization rideshare drivers make a fair transition to electric vehicles, so this includes Uber, taxi, and other commercial transportation service providers, communities can realize 3 to 4 times greater emission savings as compared to when your average car owner makes that switch to an electric vehicle. And according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, who has been one of our most outspoken environmental critics, each trip on an EV on a ride-sharing network like Uber cuts emissions by about 53% compared with private vehicle trip, compared with a private vehicle trip in the average car. If it's a pool trip or a shared trip in an EV, the emission savings grow to 68%. The other key insight is that it's a lot easier to sell electric trips than electric cars. You spread that cost over, and so the opportunity to manage that cost. But the reality is that there's only a small number of drivers that have made that transition so far, and there's reasons for it that are challenging. There remains a lack of appropriate charging, affordable options, and insufficient financial incentives to close the cost gap. And that the economics are just simply a lot harder to make work. Drivers using an battery electric vehicle, they suffer both higher costs and reduced earning opportunities. And so we committed to helping close that gap. And so we committed that over the next 2 decades, we are going to build a zero emission multimodal platform. And so over the next 5 years, we're committing $800 million in resources to help hundreds of thousands of drivers transition to EVs around the world. We have committed to enabling 100% of passenger trips in zero tailpipe emission vehicles and on public transit. So by 2030, 100% of rides will take place in battery EVs in the US, Canada, and European cities. And then by 2040, 100% of rides on the platform globally will be emissions free. But again, this is only possible through public partnership, and so we are looking forward to working with planners, advocates, NGOs to take steps to again build a stronger policy framework to achieve these goals. And a few of the key ones here that we hope to work with all of you on over the coming years. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it, and look forward to answering any questions.
All right, I guess that's my cue to get started.
Yep.
Presentation. I think there's a short presentation that will be on the screen when I present. I'll try to give a cue to advance just a few of the slides. Good morning. My name is Chris Thomas, and I'm on LIFT's public policy team, leading government relations for the Western U.S. I'm based here in the Seattle area. I joined LIFT in mid-February, right before the pandemic began, which means I had about 2 normal weeks at LIFT before transportation, as we all know it, fundamentally changed. Some background about me: I'm a civil engineer by training and was a project manager early in my career, working for some construction companies and consulting engineering companies, 2 of which spent a lot of time working and advocating before this organization, CH2M Hill and WSP. For about the last 20 years, I've primarily worked in the area of transportation and infrastructure public policy. A public policy career began when I worked on Capitol Hill for Congressman Ray LaHood, who later became President Obama's first Secretary of Transportation. And I actually work now for President Obama's second US DOT Secretary, Anthony Fox, here at LIFT. So I've had the opportunity to work around transportation most of my career, and have worked alongside some outstanding transportation leaders and some really cool transportation projects. I say this because coming to LIFT this year has been really a natural next step, because so many of our advocacy goals align with my own transportation advocacy in the past, but also that of this organization. From our sustainability and electric vehicle goals to our efforts to transform cities and streets and make them more accessible for multimodal transportation. And then to LIFT's interest in working alongside labor to advance worker protections for drivers. These are all critical areas of focus for us here at LIFT, and I can dive into some of these issues here today. I'll start with the second slide, which is LIFT's mission, which is to improve the people's lives with the world's best transportation. Our vision is to provide transportation access to everyone, especially the communities that need it most. And that basically includes redefining how we view transportation's role in connecting communities and providing positive societal impacts on both our riders and our drivers. I know transportation equity is an important part of this organization's mission. And so on the next slide, I'll spend a few minutes sharing what our efforts on equity have looked like both before the pandemic and then during the pandemic. To us, rideshare helps create equitable communities by providing transportation to essential services and by providing flexible earnings opportunities for those who want to have control over how, when, and where they work. For riders, we help bridge the economic divide between the transportation haves and the transportation have-nots. We pride ourselves on being an affordable and accessible option. And in Seattle, we're an important service for those communities that are traditionally underserved by transit. In this region, nearly 40% of all rides start and end in underserved communities. So we help those who lack access to their own vehicles or public transportation, and we can help them access employment, education, medical needs, and other critical destinations. And our Lyft Up Ride program provides free access to healthcare or groceries or jobs or school or voting or shelter when they need it. And we're often a first and last mile transit bridge. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but in Seattle, about 55% of riders use the service to connect to public transit. For drivers, the platform has reshaped the way drivers work. On-demand work empowers the workforce to be in control over their own lives and serves as an economic backstop when other industries shed workers. There's a low barrier of entry for this kind of work, and overwhelmingly we hear from the driver community how important flexibility and independence is. It's often counterintuitive to what people think, but our drivers are mostly part-time, working very few hours a week. And in Seattle, 96% of rideshare drivers, and that includes both Lyft and Uber drivers, drive fewer than 40 hours per week. And 31% of drivers drive fewer than 5 hours a week. 90% of drivers are telling us that flexibility is very or extremely important. And these are drivers that are retirees, students, veterans, people with disabilities, caregivers, and other individuals who have full-time jobs and who drive for supplemental income. About 1% of the US workforce has chosen this flexible path by driving with Lyft. In this region, there are about 30,000 rideshare drivers registered in the county and about 14,000 active drivers in a given week. 63% of drivers identify as a person of color. We often like to say it matters how you get there. And for several years, our co-founders have been committed to implementing a modern workforce protection system for Lyft drivers. This means providing opportunities for people to have the flexibility to choose when, where, and how much they work, and ensure that they have access to worker protections like accident, death, disability, and healthcare insurance. I'll speak more in a bit about how we finally helped the state of California realize that particular goal. So I lay all this out about why the service has been important to both riders and to drivers because it speaks to how ride sharing has cemented itself as an essential service during the pandemic. The pandemic reinforced the transportation equity gap, unfortunately, but it's also highlighted how ride sharing is helping to bridge that gap. Lyft has remained an essential service as governments around the country recognized when they did shutdowns, ride sharing would be a critical way to augment other transportation service reductions. And especially for those who haven't had the luxury of working from home, like many of us have. It's generally been perceived as a safer way to get around by those who don't want to get on a crowded bus or train. And with the distribution of PPE to drivers, with our rider and driver health safety commitment, and a suspension of shared rides, it's proven itself to be an effective way to limit exposure to others and travel in a safer environment. We've seen a higher percentage of rides among essential workers who are choosing rideshare as a perceived safer option than public transportation. And during the pandemic, our data has showed that 8 of the 10 most popular Seattle rideshare destinations were essential service locations. They were healthcare facilities, they were grocery stores, and they were convenience stores. And interesting, the other 2 destinations were the Delta terminal and the Alaska terminal, showing that even with the decline in aviation demand, rideshare remains an essential part of the air travel experience. As we all know, the pandemic has been especially hard on lower income communities. And like many organizations, Lyft has been working to ensure those hardest hit still have access to earnings opportunities and to transportation. The pandemic has made rideshare even more increasingly important as an income source. We continue to hear from our driver community that because of the impacts of their primary work, whether they've been laid off or furloughed or their work has been shuttered, they're relying more than ever on Lyft as a supplemental income source or even a primary income source. We've provided more earnings opportunities through initiatives like expanding the platform to include delivery partnerships to get essential goods to people in need. And we introduced priority driving times to allow drivers to maximize their earnings when they're on the road. And we've reduced rental rates for those who rent vehicles from our Express Drive program. We also provided new benefits for drivers. Earlier this year, we partnered with One Medical to provide an on-demand virtual Medicare service to drivers at no cost, and we provided access to COVID testing. And though this was already a goal before the pandemic set in, I mentioned California's Prop 22, which is a historic victory for drivers who polling shows overwhelmingly want to continue having the independence and flexibility of being an independent contractor, but also want to have access to benefits such as accident, death, disability, and healthcare insurance. For those riders who found themselves unable to support their own transportation needs, we've been able to help as well. We've always had a history of supporting racial justice efforts, but in response to the pandemic, we've worked to focus our efforts even more to bridge the transportation gap that has existed for historically underserved communities. In Washington State, that's meant providing about $400,000 worth of free ride credits to 27 different organizations providing essential services. And it includes providing rides to interviews and job opportunities, providing rides to survivors experiencing domestic violence, providing rides to volunteers on suicide prevention hotlines, and providing rides to frontline workers. So next I'll talk about the future of ride sharing. Post-pandemic, what does it look like beyond the pandemic when we all emerge from this? We believe it will continue to fill that first and last mile gap between transit, and it will play a major part in reducing transportation barriers. 47% of riders use Lyft to get around when public transit does not operate. And as I noted, 55% of riders have used ride-sharing service to get to and from transit. But in addition to the traditional rideshare service, micromobility will also play a huge role in reducing transportation barriers. To illustrate, 35% of US vehicle trips are under 2 miles, and 60% of trips are under 6 miles. These are all trips that for many people could be replaced by a pedal bike, a scooter, or an e-bike. And that's why Lyft is offering those options, because in some of these cases, the traveler might not even need transit or rideshare at all. Increasingly, we're offering not just rideshare, but access to bikes and scooters and buses and trains within the app. Lyft operates very popular bike share programs across the US, such as City Bike in New York and Divvy in Chicago. And we just recently began operating Biketown in Portland. So between micromobility and rideshare, Lyft users can access a multimodal suite of services with multiple transportation options, including transit and buses, at their fingertips. And users can right-size their transportation mode to the specific needs of each particular trip. And as I indicated, through this pandemic, governments and the general public have been seeing ride sharing as less of a luxury or less of a nice to have service and more of an essential must-have transportation utility. And as such, we think there will continue to be a trend away from car ownership as transportation as a service becomes more widely adopted. We are transforming how people view personal car ownership, and we continue to see people want the freedom of transportation without the burden of personal car ownership. The average American household spends an average of $9,000 a year on their vehicles and only uses their cars less than 5% of the time. 50% of passengers say they don't own a car because of services like Lyft, which is really important in cities like Seattle, where we're seeing a decrease in car ownership and an increase in public transportation. We will continue to add a portfolio of transportation that you can subscribe to, much in the same way you can stream movies and TV shows or music. So just like people can subscribe to an entertainment streaming service and no longer have DVDs or CDs, we believe that in Lyft's ecosystem, the future will mean that you will have access to any type of transportation service you need. We've seen many industries, including cloud computing, switch from the ownership model to a service model, and they've done this very quickly. We think it will take a little bit longer in transportation because it's a bigger behavioral change, and because, frankly, only a small percentage relative to the overall population even has widespread access to these services now. But we do see it moving in that direction. We also believe, similar to what Caleb indicated, that the future of ride sharing will completely shift to electric vehicles. And Lyft, in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund, recently announced a commitment to reach 100% electric vehicles on the Lyft platform by 2030. The shift to 100% EVs will mean transitioning all vehicles to an all-electric or other zero-emission technologies. But at the end of the day, it's very important to remember that the burden of this 2030 commitment is on us, and it's not on the drivers. We need the support of policymakers and partners to be able to advocate for policies that drive down the cost of EVs, expand EV incentives and infrastructure, and help drivers switch to all electric over time in a way that's cost effective, sustainable, and profitable. So to reach that commitment, it will require the collective action of industry, government, nonprofit organizations, and many others to overcome the significant barriers that are currently preventing wide-scale electrification. That is the upfront cost of the vehicle and the access to reliable and affordable charging. So while the future of transportation is undoubtedly exciting, as we move beyond the pandemic, we cannot forget to ensure that we remain focused on closing the transportation equity gap for riders, and by ensuring rideshare remains a critical way to access flexible earnings opportunities and expanded access to benefits. This year has shown us that much of our transportation equity gaps are the byproduct of generations of systemic racism. And as such, we've greatly expanded our racial justice work. Through a partnership with the Obama Foundation's My Brother's Keeper Alliance, the National Urban League, and other organizations, we're providing access to 1.5 million rides to under-resourced Black communities. And also here in Washington State, I'm pleased to announce that we just launched a new Racial Justice Community Grant Alliance, which will award cash and ride credit grants to organizations that execute a mission to combat and/or address the impacts of systemic racism. The Alliance Committee will be led by community leaders of color that will collaborate with LIFT team members and award the grants. I also mentioned ensuring drivers can continue to access both flexible earning opportunities and get expanded access to benefits. California's Proposition 22 was a historic win for drivers, for riders, and for the economy. It ensured app-based drivers will continue to have access to flexible earnings opportunities by remaining classified as independent contractors while receiving a guaranteed minimum earning standard with no upward limit on what they can earn, along with healthcare, death, disability insurance, and a variety of training and protections that would not ordinarily be available to contractors. 1 million rideshare and delivery drivers in California will be able to keep their independence and earn these benefits now. They will continue to have the gig economy as a safety net for people struggling with unemployment. And we believe it's important to ensure drivers outside of California will also have access to worker protections and benefits. And we're eager to continue engaging in conversations with policymakers and with labor about how to develop solutions that will similarly allow drivers to keep their flexibility and access new benefits. Thank you for the opportunity to present here today, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, are there any questions? Kelly.
Yeah, I'm curious, and Chris, you mentioned this briefly in your presentation. One of the biggest sort of barriers, I guess I see as we move our transportation system forward is behavioral changes. And those are obviously the most difficult barrier to overcome, is how we as each individuals consume the product. What are you guys looking at? And I would address this to Caleb too. I mean, I think you've highlighted a few of them, but from a policy perspective to drive behavioral changes, you can kind of do it from two ways. You can carrot it or you can stick it. So you can incentivize people or you can mandate. How are you guys looking at that, driving that behavioral change, and what things are you thinking of in that regard?
Well, I think the key is to make it as available and as accessible as we can to everyone, and expand the access as much as we can. And I mentioned that by having a variety of multimodal opportunities available, so that someone can create or have access to whatever service that they want that fits the particular needs of that trip. I think that's the key. I think if you provide people with options and take away the need to have, a car that's constantly available and sitting empty in one's garage, I think that's what probably perhaps the greatest accelerator can be to making it available on more of a wide scale basis.
Yeah, look, I think to achieve the sort of vision that we have, I think we need both, to be honest, both the carrot and the stick. And there's some ways, particularly on the EV transition side, that carrots are going to be, I think, critically important, and providing those incentives to encourage people to make that move and to close that financial gap that currently exists for a lot of for-hire drivers today. But then on the other side, look, I think we're gonna need some sticks, and we've been supporters of road pricing in an effort to really force individuals to more directly realize the costs of the transportation choices that they're making, and that's going to be a very key way to driving the change that we need to address congestion and sustainability issues.
And can you talk a little bit too about how you're viewing addressing the rural transportation needs at all? I mean, I know that that's an issue in some of our smaller communities where they, will often say we don't have, we have one Uber driver, we have one Lyft driver, it's very few and far between. How are you guys working with rural communities? And what do you see as Lyft and Uber's role in those communities?
So go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, Caleb. I think it would help by establishing a statewide framework. Washington is one of only 4 states in the U.S. that doesn't have a statewide framework, and I think what we've seen in other states is that the more certainty we can create at the state level around what the regulatory structure would be in a variety of communities, I think provides. At least, I don't want to speak for Uber, but from Lyft's standpoint, it provides us with a better certainty, if you will, to go out and actively invest in and making sure that there's additional access in all corners of the state, including rural communities.
So look, I'd agree that the ability for drivers to have a single statewide license or registration that enabled them to operate in smaller communities and move around as needed would be very helpful. I think our focus has been trying to develop partnerships in those areas where we can meet needs for a lower cost. So partnerships with transit agencies or hospital systems to provide non-emergency medical transportation. And if we can begin to create those work opportunities, meet those local needs, that's going to help build out the networks that are required to, again, create more transportation options for people. And again, we support investments in mass transit sort of across the state, and how do we support transit systems that, again, meet different needs, but still very critical needs in more rural areas.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Prima.
This was great, you guys. I really appreciate, Chris, you touching on the equity aspects, and of course, Caleb, always thought-provoking when we get to hear from you. Thanks for bringing up the statewide regulatory structure. I think that is something the commission really needs to consider when it puts forward its annual report, is the urging of enactment of that. I think it's been a hindrance on a number of levels to deploying more mobility options for residents all over the state. One question to both of you is, as you know, we've been working on the road usage charge and looking at that long-term sustainable funding source for our infrastructure. And you both noted pretty lofty goals of going to full EV deployment, whether it's in the next decade or two. How do you guys see yourselves playing in both the investment of the charging infrastructure, as you mentioned, partnerships, waiting for the federal or state governments to get that penetration of infrastructure is going to be challenging with all the other needs. So, curious where you see your company's investments lining up with that, as well as talking a little bit more about how you're going to get these EVs in the hands of your drivers, given they're independent contractors. So thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So look, it's all of the above, right? So, look, we don't have the resources to put fast chargers in the homes of everybody that might want to drive. And I mean, look, there's no doubt that right now it is it's just a fact that charging is mostly in places that makes it convenient for people of means, and not in the places that people who want to do rideshare need it, both in terms of being able to charge at night and then being able to charge during the day, or during the time when they're trying to work. And so what we are I think our first step is providing information to planners and to the many different organizations that are working on the expansion of charging infrastructure, to try and identify locations that are really going to encourage adoption by these drivers, where the community is going to get the maximum bang for their buck. And so we at Uber are working on some third-party research to try to sort of figure out what is the most effective use of charging infrastructure dollars, either public or private, that is going to create the maximum impact. On the rider side, on the driver side of actually getting them to convert, we're doing a few things. One, we've signed partnerships with a number of the OEMs to actually have substantial discounts and ease the ability for people to get their hands on vehicles. And then, quite frankly, much of that $800 million that we've committed over the next several years is designed to be sort of more or less a direct financial incentive to help close those gaps, and to make the vehicles more accessible. And again, I think the reality too is that we know that we need another generation of quite frankly of used vehicles with long ranges becoming available, and so we're going to try and sort of front load as much as we can, but at the same time recognizing that we're going to have, hopefully, between 2025 and 2030, a fairly robust used car market in the longer range EVs that will be much more attractive than a lot of the used EVs that are available today.
I would just note, I echo everything Caleb said, and I would also note that I think that even though we know that right now the upfront cost of EVs are higher today than gas-powered vehicles, because they have lower fuel and maintenance costs, it means tremendously lower operating costs for drivers over the life of the vehicle. And so we're already seeing this for drivers who rent cars through our Express Drive program. So the drivers who rent an EV through that program, they're already saving an average of $50 to $70 per week on fuel costs alone. And we're certainly going to see that differential of savings increase over time as the cost of EV batteries go down. But I think it really speaks to the fact that what remains as the key hurdle is the initial upfront cost of the battery, which drives, of course, the upfront cost of the vehicle. They've come down about 90% in the past decade, and we certainly expect that to accelerate by mid-decade. And we think that will significantly help bridge that gap in terms of the difference. It probably will eclipse, I think, we think that by about mid-decade, the cost of an EV will be at parity or below of what a gas-powered vehicle is. But that doesn't solve the other issue, which is the access to reliable and affordable charging. For most drivers, it's probably not an issue, because if at least if they have a source, for those drivers who have a source, they're driving very few hours a day, and so their access to, if they have access to charging, their capacity of the battery in the vehicle is not necessarily going to be an issue. But for many drivers, it will be, because if they don't have access to reliable, affordable, and quick charging. And I think that's where we've all got to work together with policymakers to make sure that the network is built out in a way that can get drivers access to that quickly.
I'm hoping we can work with you guys as we advance road usage charging, because while there may be an attraction today to drive the EV because you're not having to buy gas, we do have the highest flat fee in the nation right now for EV registration at $225 a year. And if we ultimately transition to road usage charging, that requirement to pay for the roads we're all driving on doesn't go away. So the economics for the drivers have to be considered in that fact that while there may be some cost benefit today, we're hopeful that everybody's going to be able to contribute to the use of the road. So that's something I think we should keep talking with you guys about, and how we can explore and see where it fits in our research round we have going right now of exploring rideshare impacts as we look long term on how we're going to fund our system.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rima. Look forward to that.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, Caleb and Chris, thank you for your very informative presentation. Your perspective on COVID, post-COVID rather, will be very useful to us going forward, and I want to thank you for your time. With that, I'm going to move forward with the break, and so we'll take a 5-minute break at this point, and be back at 11:20. 5-minute break. Okay, it's 11:20, so let's go ahead and start back up. And finally, we'll hear from Annabelle, who is the head of State and Government Affairs, Waymo, and she'll be addressing technology advancements that they are making in the COVID era as they move towards a new future in transportation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And just checking, is my audio clear?
It is.
Great. And let me try to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. And let me know, can you see my presentation in presentation mode?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm very glad that I'm not standing between you and a bio break, so I appreciate it. Again, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Annabelle Chang, Head of State Policy and Government Affairs for Waymo. I also have the honor of serving on the Washington AV Work Group Executive Committee as well. A little bit of background about myself. I joined Waymo this last summer, and previous to that, I was with Alaska Airlines, and prior to that, I was also at Lyft. So I've got transportation in my blood through and through. And I wanted to give a little bit of background on autonomous vehicle technology. Many of you may be super familiar with it, but just to give a little bit of context before we go into the COVID-19 conversation. So Waymo, we are building the world's most experienced driver, and Waymo stands for A Way Forward in Mobility. And we have been in operation for over 10 years now at this point. Initially, we were part of the Google self-driving car project, and our early days began with a DARPA challenge. And we have now moved into a company called Waymo. We've done 20 million miles worth of testing of our autonomous vehicle technology on public roads, 15 billion in simulation, and we have our footprint's even expanded beyond the 25 cities, but we are all over the United States with our testing. And that cumulatively is thousands of years of driving. And that expertise and experience is shared across our entire fleet. And back in 2015, so this is over 5 years ago, we were the world's very first autonomous car ride on a public road. And this was in Austin, Texas. This gentleman is Steve Mahan. He is visually impaired. And it was his very first time to Austin, Texas. And he was sitting in this car solo, driving around by himself. This is in our early days. We were actually manufacturing the vehicle at the time, and this was called the Firefly. Waymo has since moved on from the Firefly, and we are now partnering with OEMs, and our technology is the actual driver. So let me go through a little bit of background here on the levels of driving. So this is a common parlance in the industry. This is levels set by the Society of Automotive Engineers, and this has been sort of the framework that a lot of regulators look at. So if you look at the 5 different levels, number 1 is driver assistance, that's cruise control. Level 2 and level 3 is kind of what you may see on some vehicles out on the roads. What it requires is a human has to be sitting in that front driver's seat, has to be paying attention, and generally has to have a hand on the steering wheel. So this is not the technology that we are developing. We are developing fully autonomous technology, which is called level 4 and 5 technology, which does not require a person sitting in the front at all. You could be in the back, you could be just like Steve, sitting in the back, and letting Waymo do the driving for you. So we call that high automation. Most companies right now are what we call aspiring to this level 4 technology. Waymo has been doing this level 4 technology since 2015. And level 5 doesn't exist yet. It's still, I would say, a little bit in the realm of science fiction, but the idea is that you would be able to potentially drop a fully automated car anywhere and they could drive. Right now, the technology requires mapping beforehand. And so that is part of the reason why we're going to cities all over the country trying to do some initial mapping. And let me go here. And so we are creating this Waymo driver, which is a suite of different technologies. So it is both the hardware and the software. And what I'll share with you is that a lot of what we're doing is first in the world. We're learning as we build as well. And so, how do people interact with a fully automated car? How do they respond? How does it respond to the environment? All of these questions are ones that we're grappling with for the very first time, which is thrilling, but it is also one that has serious concerns of like, how do we work with regulators? How do we work with the public to make sure that people understand the potential and the promise of this technology? And let me go here. And a little bit of background on our current operations. So you'll see here the bigger dots are where we have a larger footprint of depots or warehouses or office space. But we also have done quite a bit of regular testing in Washington State. So we do testing in Kirkland for weather, rain testing specifically. This year is 1 year we were not able to do so because of COVID-19, but we hope to resume that once again. And I just realized the slide is slightly out of date. We actually just announced a new partnership in Ohio as well, where we are working on a closed course and actually simulating a miniature city to encounter some of the more challenging aspects of driving that we might not be able to create on a public road or experience on a public road, but we want our vehicles and our Waymo driver to be prepared for it. So what is the Waymo driver? So let me go into the hardware. So it's a combination of LiDAR. We have some of the leading LiDAR technology in the world, and we have cameras. We have 29 cameras equipped on the car, and we have a radar system. And it has a 360 view of the world around it in real time. And it is highly, highly sophisticated. And in a way, we say that it can actually look into the future. So the car is able to predict and see things beyond what a human is able to do. And it is working in concert with our software. And I don't have any images about software, but it is a combination of both machine learning and AI. And there have been really exponential leaps in how we can advance this Waymo driver. You can see our two vehicles here that you'll see on the passenger side. The first one in the back is the Chrysler Pacifica, which is a plug-in hybrid. And then the one in the front is the Jaguar I-Pace, which is an all-electric vehicle and is now going to be the vehicle platform, is what we call it, for our very newest technology. So Waymo is growing increasingly interested in EV charging infrastructure and EV access. And where does our Waymo driver go? It goes in two different business lines for us. One is Waymo One, and that is about moving people, and that is going to be our ride-hailing program. And then Waymo Via, which is about moving goods. And there's two aspects of that. One is heavy-duty trucking, and then the other is local goods delivery. In terms of local goods delivery, we're up and running in Arizona with some partnerships with UPS and AutoNation. And let me go through here. And we've had some really exciting announcements in 2020. And given the hardships of 2020, we're incredibly proud that we were able to still make this happen. Waymo 1 has been up and running in Arizona since 2017, and it was with what we call an early rider program. So these are individuals of the public who love to beta test things and wanted to give user feedback and wanted to be the first in the world to really experience this fully automated technology. And we have in October just opened it up to the general public. So we are the world's very first commercial, fully automated ride-hailing service in the world history. And it's, we hope that, post-COVID, that at some point when you potentially fly into Phoenix, you are able to get a Waymo and experience the thrill and the excitement of the experience. And I'm going to try something which is play video. So if it doesn't go well, I apologize beforehand. I'm not the tech person, but I'm going to try my best. And I think a video kind of explains it better than I could.
Driving by itself. Dude, no driver, Daddy. See?
That is nuts. It's pretty crazy. It's like there's a ghost at the steering wheel. I kind of feel like royalty being paraded around in this thing.
School zone.
Look at these guys. Look it over.
Are they?
No driver.
Go! What? So Waymo thinks it's cruising.
Crazy. It's like
So thank you. I wanted to kind of give a little taste of what that experience is like. We've had thousands of rides now in this fully automated driver system, and people are using it to go to dinner, go commute, get around, run errands. I will share that this video was filmed pre-COVID, so we have new sort of procedures in place that I will walk through later in the video, the program. And then as part of this launch of our Waymo 1 program, we also have had a partnership with Valley Metro, which was a first mile, last mile partnership. It lasted 2 years, and there is a report coming out next month about our partnership and learnings. And we hope to continue to do these types of partnerships into the future with agencies around the country and potentially around the world. And we were helping to provide that first mile, last mile connection with our Waymos. A little bit about the trucking capabilities. So just this, maybe 2 months ago now at this point, we also announced an extraordinary partnership with Daimler to create a new version of the Freightliner Cascadia, which is their leading heavy duty truck. And it will be integrated with the Waymo driver. And we believe that there's going to be significant benefits to the world of trucking and to moving goods. And as I mentioned before, we also have this local goods delivery as well. Wanted to share a little bit about Waymo's COVID-19 response. We did shut down all of our testing and operations in March across the country, which is very challenging for a company. I mean, really over the last 10 years, we've been working day and night, really pushing this technology forward, and to have to take a significant pause was very hard for the progress of the technology and the business, but we knew it was the right thing to do. We also held multiple surveys, and we learned that more than half of our survey respondents were extremely concerned about exposure to COVID-19. So before we were able to go back to testing and going back to, or even considering launching our public service, we had to take multiple precautions. So I'd like to share that with you here. And these are all new. I will say this is part of our commercial service, and our only commercial service to the public right now is in Chandler, Arizona. And so we are doing health screenings of all of those who help maintain our fleet. And we're doing very frequent vehicle cleanings, and I'll share some of the photos there. And we also have a cabin air flush that helps refresh the air throughout the car. And then we also provide Clorox and hand sanitizer, et cetera, throughout the vehicle. Have also ordered protective partitions. So I say that because the video you saw did not obviously have the protective partitions, but we have protective partitions separating the front and the back of the cars in the case we ever have like a test driver in the front. And as I may have shared before, it turns out plexiglass is very hard to find during a global pandemic. So that was a delayed process to get that. Something that is unusual and great about having a fully automated car is that we can actually do remote vehicle inspections between each ride. And if we do need something cleaned, we can call the car back to our depots and get it cleaned. And we also have an ask of our community. So these are currently the asks that we have for our riders, which is obviously that there's a health agreement in place, that you wear a face covering. We have, and I'll share a little anecdote of something that we learned along the way. So we have, when we were preparing to launch our commercial service, we had a few testers come, and there were, members of the public are part of our early rider program. Get back into a Waymo vehicle that had been prepared for a post-COVID world. And the gentleman that we had was, standing outside of the car waiting for his Waymo to arrive, and he had a face mask on. And once he got into his Waymo and the door opened for him and he got in, he relaxed and took off his mask. And, we were very surprised by that because he had been wearing his mask beforehand, et cetera. And we had to have on audio remind him, sir, can you please put on your face mask? And he's like, oh, okay. So he put his face mask on. And in our interviews subsequent to that, we asked him, like, why did you take off your face mask? You were wearing the face mask before, there's, face mask mandates. And he said, well, there was no one else in the car but me. And so I felt very comfortable that I'm the only one in my household. That is a real demonstration to us of the future desire to have these fully automated, rides, that there was a level of comfort being by yourself or within just your own household. But it also meant that we had to make a few adjustments to our COVID-19 protocols. So, for example, not only did we have to add in-app notifications about wearing a face mask and some of these health agreements that you see here, but we also put stickers now throughout the car. So it's very, very hard to ignore that you should be wearing a face mask, even if you are the only person in the car. And then, of course, we also ask that, in a place like Chandler, you actually can roll down the windows and keep the air flowing. So these are some of the lessons that we've learned in a COVID-19 world. And I will share that unlike some of the earlier speakers, we are still only commercially available in one place, but obviously we hope to expand into the future. And it's been a great opportunity for us to learn. And even though we've had to pause much of our testing during a portion of this year, we were able to continue to do testing and simulation and continue to make sure that our technology advances forward. I also wanted to show some of the photos here of the actual cleaning. So this is, wiping down of the vehicles. This is our spray disinfectant, and then we track which vehicles are disinfected. And this happens multiple times a day. I also want to share two other items that might be of interest to this group. Also in the last, we've had a very busy Q4, we announced the world's very first safety framework for fully automated driving, and released two white papers that I believe maybe the team has sent to you beforehand. One is about how we make our decisions to ensure that our vehicle is safe and ready for the public. And that's our framework. So it's both hardware, software, and vehicle behavior. And then we also have publicly shared all of our data from the last few years of operation in Arizona and what lessons we've learned from that experience. We are the first in the world to really experience this and to have this data, and so we wanted to share it with the world. And we also have something in place called the Law Enforcement Interaction Plan. Again, we were the first in the world to have this. And this is how does law enforcement interact with the vehicles? For a fully automated car, there are new questions that law enforcement may have never considered or fathomed before. How do you communicate with the vehicle? How do you turn it off? How do you get it to pull over to the side? If there is a serious accident, how do you physically open the car? How do you unlock the doors? And so all of this information is posted publicly on that website. And we do frequent trainings with law enforcement. So where we currently operate in Arizona, we have a very good relationship with law enforcement and stay in tune with them. We have a training video on the website. These are all, I say, novel questions that both industry and law enforcement are learning to work together. And we're excited to help lead the way on some of these discussions. And I think that's it. I shortened my presentation so I could get to some of your questions. And that's it from me. I will turn it back over to Chairman Jennings.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, I'll ask again. Are there any questions? Rima.
I always have questions.
Apparently I have to ask twice, so.
Hi, Annabelle. This was great. Can you talk a little bit more about, you showed the video, right, of this AV driving folks around. I assume it's being operated remotely or monitored remotely. And can you just talk a little bit more about how that functionality works if there was an incident or a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have two different, there's two different sort of supervision elements that are happening on a fully automated car. So one is, rider support. So it's essentially like, customer service. You can tap into your app or into the car and, you can say like, oh, there's something dirty here, or hey, we've been stopped at the stop sign for quite a while and we haven't moved, things like that. And that rider support is monitoring the ride. So it's a little bit different, right? While you are the only one physically in the car, or your household is the only one physically in the car, there is a virtual supervision component. And that is, mostly like you asking, but in a situation like COVID, we try to monitor, for example, if people are wearing face masks or not, or, following safe behavior, or if people are making sure to buckle in their children into a car seat. And then there's also the vehicle support side. So if there's something happening to the vehicle itself, maybe it's stalled or whatever it may be, there is also a team that is monitoring the vehicles themselves. But really, the driver is the Waymo driver. And the decisions that it makes are the ones that, that it is a kind of combination of what I said, the AI, the machine learning, and the sensors. And so while it is, you may be the only one car, there's a lot of things happening surrounding that ride that your eye doesn't even see.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Roger?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Annabelle, thank you for a great presentation. I asked one of your colleagues one time what you needed from us as infrastructure owners and operators, and the response was better paint and signs. We've got the rest of it. You've developed a system of autonomous vehicles, but they're not connected vehicles. We're investing and will likely continue to invest in wayside technology that'll be owned by government. Do you anticipate your system interacting with our system, providing data to our system or city systems or regional systems? Or will you just be, again, that anonymous thing moving through our space?
So for the first question about sort of the infrastructure component, that is accurate, that we are building our technology for the landscape as it is now. So we don't have that connected need, but we are partners with one of the new connected sort of organizations called CAVNU in Michigan, CAVNUE, and we're part of that conversation. But it is not a requirement in order for us to operate. On the other hand, I could see benefits to it from a trucking perspective as well. But the technology is very nascent on the trucking side. So unlike passenger hailing side, we have not yet moved to a fully automated trucking experience. So right now we still have test drivers behind the wheel. And the challenge of trucking is very different than passenger hailing. It's was potentially less complex. It is faster speeds. It is the ability to stop with a heavy load. And so there is, varying weights, right? Continually varying weights. And so that, I think those questions, there may be some possibility there, but at this time, it is not a sort of precursor, or not the right word, a prerequisite for our ability to operate. We do participate in conversations on data sharing with different municipalities. Of course, it's all very early, but we're part of the OMF in Los Angeles, which is trying to help create a different type of transportation visibility and network. So that might be something worth looking into if there's a parallel there. But that's the answer to the question is, right now we don't need the connected infrastructure, but I think we're in the early stages of wanting to kind of understand where we can be helpful, of course, to our government partners.
No, I appreciate that, because the investments we're thinking about, maybe we don't need paint and signs if the technology is there and it is completely deployed. We could geofence a neighborhood for a speed limit rather than posting signs all over the place, which are expensive to maintain over time. We can provide information on incidents or information on weather. Some of the roadside stuff we've done, you were talking about trucking. There's a wonderful pilot going on Interstate 80 in Wyoming, where they're providing the trucking community with information about weather, wind, crashes, and the like, because they were having these horrific crashes that were like miles long, involving 70 or 80 trucks that were operating in these windy, blizzardy conditions. And the roadside technology is really enhancing the safety there, but only if the vehicles connect to it.
That is helpful to know. I think what I will share is we are up and running with our testing for trucking in the corridor right now of Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, and along with several other of our competitors. But again, for all of us, no one's sort of reached that level 4 capability yet on trucking. But I can certainly see value in especially on the highways, in having sort of real-time access to that information and potentially sharing some of that information because our vehicles are really gigantic computers.
Yeah, and we have our ATMS system and other things that operate in downtown Seattle, now down in Vancouver and across Snoqualmie Pass with variable speed limits and the like. And again, the ability to communicate would enhance the safety, and it might result for us in better safety at lower cost. So just stuff to think about as you move forward. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll just add that I forgot to mention is that really all level 4 technology right now, the necessity is for mapping. So you cannot launch and operate in a city or a location really without having mapped it first. So you'll see the Waymos in Arizona, and we have a lot of mapping happening throughout California. This is all a prerequisite to getting an actual fully automated operation in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there may be a day when we find some efficiencies in having one map instead of everybody having their own map. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay. Annabelle, thank you for your work on the AV Executive Work Group. And I want to thank you for a very thoughtful and informative presentation.
Thank you
Again,
so much.
thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Okay, according to the schedule, we're going for a break, but since we already had our break, next up will be commission business. And can all the commissioners turn on their video and mics? And in case anybody was wondering,